Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. And it's live on the 3rd of April. Had to think then. 3rd of April, coming up to 10:30. I'm an hour later than I was before, and I apologise for that. I did go out for a walk, and I've made two videos from one walk. Last night, just to clarify, Matt Hancock, the health secretary, on a programme called Question Time, was asked, from what I understand, about the driving to go and get your exercise or a walk. And I understand, I didn't see it, but a number of people did, and they've confirmed this, that he did answer the question to say it was permissible to drive a short distance so that you could park and then go for a walk in the countryside, as long as you kept yourself to yourself. You weren't meeting lots of people, and you avoided everybody else. And I think it is that short distance. So I interpret that. I mean, we've all got to use common sense. So I interpret that as if you're in town, and it's a mile to get out of town, and you can park in a safe place, and you can go for a walk, and then get back in your car and come home, and then you spend the rest of the day at home. It seems that that's, to me, is what he means. So this morning, knowing that everybody would, of course, get in their car and think, thank God we can go for a walk and drive to places, I figured I would go early and get into the countryside. And I did, so I've made two walks from what I could have carried on walking for another hour and perhaps made 4 videos, but I knew I had to get back to do this reading, and I didn't want to abuse the system. Anyway, so yeah, I may make these readings a bit later. We'll see how they go, because it may be that again the light was lovely this morning in the countryside and what have you, and the first of these walks will go out this afternoon. I've just got to, after I do this, I'll edit it up, the first one, and then I've got one for tomorrow morning. So that makes great sense for me. And then tomorrow, maybe if I can do the same and go somewhere and get 2 videos out of one walk, we're winning. I can make double the amount of content. I'm not abusing the system. I'm keeping myself to myself. Everybody should be happy. Of course, there's going to be those who are the naysayers and those that are frightened and what have you. And I have no intention of hurting anybody or flouting the system beyond what is common sense. And, if I'm asked by a policeman what I'm up to, I will tell them. And if I'm asked by a policeman to go home, I will go home. Simple as. We're continuing the story of J.B. Priestley's English Journey. I have to tell you, this old book that I've got, paperback book, is now falling to bits. The pages are coming out of it. The seam has cracked. Luckily, I haven't. So good morning to everybody. Les Jarvis, beg your pardon. Ramibu, Laprez, good morning to you. Ed Loud, good morning. Perry, we've got 28 people watching, which is lovely. Andy Stacey, Mr. O'Connell, bonjour de Manchester. Lovely Julia, Marriott Genealogy, Morton Lewis, buenos dias. And Turbo Stream, good morning from the city of Birminghamshire. Good morning to you. We are in Leicester in the story. And Morton says, are you aware of Lord Sumption's speech about the dangers of totalitarianism of all of this? I haven't seen. I saw an interview heard an interview that he gave the other day, about 2-3 days ago. And he was talking about that. I think he is a very sensible man. And I think he's got a lot to add to this. I think a lot of people are asking questions. I can understand also the government's role, and they are trying to protect the overall public. And how I understand it really is there are idiots in this world who just do not have any common sense. Many of them might be young and inexperienced people. We've heard of how younger people have been spitting at people, saying that they've got the disease. And I can understand the government's frustration, and the easiest policy is to say keep everybody indoors and on lockdown, and it's all going to be okay. I completely understand all of that. But at the same time, the totalitarianism of this, for people who are sensible, use common sense, have a bit of nous, and need to get out for their mental health, can see all of that. Hello to David Chamberlain from Dubai. Hello to you, sir. Ed Loud, common sense. Now we're talking my language. Anything common? Yes. Greenwich Common, I think. Joe Ann Appleby. Hello, Richard. I'm enjoying the English journey. Thank you. Well, I will crack on. This is not the place for political discussion. This is really just about the reading. I just wanted to say hello to you and explain why I was a little late this morning. Must have been a real mood booster for you to get back out into the countryside. Oh my God. You'll see in the video I am quite passionate about it. There is blackthorn in bloom. There is hawthorn coming out with the green leaves. And there were horses. There was countryside. There were rooks. There was the South Downs. I passed through a churchyard. Beautiful church, English countryside. Just so sorely missed. If anything, sometimes it is good to restrict yourself, not in this way, of course, but it is good to restrict yourself of certain things, because the things you take for granted, and often I take the countryside for granted because I'm constantly out there doing my videos, and you suddenly are breathing in that air, and you're looking at things, and you're noticing it as if that is the last day on this earth. If every day is your last day on earth, you're going to appreciate everything so much more. It was truly wonderful. And I wish everybody could have been there, but then it would have been, of course, a death hole. So I feel, says Turbo Stream says, sadly, common sense is lacking. That's very true. Hello, Neil Gardner to you. Hi, how are you? Lovely to see you. And Lapres, I feel this will give us a greater appreciation of what we have to access and the things that we do. Absolutely, quite right. So let's carry on with this. I apologise that my book is falling to pieces. We left him in J.B. Priestley was in Leicester, and the great thing about this is I can just take each page out and toss them aside as I read them. So we left him in Leicester, and he's going to go to Nottingham. But just to say that because I went out early and got back later, I haven't managed to sit and pre-read the chapter so that I would be more familiar with it. So I'm hoping my reading, I'm doing this a bit blind, so I'm hoping that my skills will be sufficient and I won't stumble too much. So let's crack on and see how we go, shall we? I probably need to have this so I can get light on the page. The next morning was bright again, and I came to it like a man creeping out of the grave. The Imperial Typewriter Company, which is a large-scale British organisation in this business, has its headquarters in Leicester, and so I went to their factory in one of the suburbs. After all, I've been using typewriters, I'm using one now to type this, for over 20 years. It's high time I saw how they were made. There are some things that you can imagine yourself making in a rough and ready fashion, but typewriters are not one of those things. And for 20 years, I have more or less taken them for granted. During that time, they have developed amazingly. I can see my first typewriter now. It had an old double keyboard, an entirely different set of keys for capitals and figures, so that the paper seemed a long way off, and the machine itself was as big and as solid as a battle cruiser. Typing then was a muscular activity. You could ache after it. If you were not familiar with these vast keyboards, your hand wandered over them like a child lost in a wood. The noise might have been that of a shipyard on the Clyde. You would no more have thought of carrying one about one of these grim iron structures than you would have thought of travelling with a piano. Since then I have owned machines of wildly different sizes and shapes and capabilities, and at this very moment possess very neat little portables, the ingenious implements of my trade. Just as some men talk about motor cars they have driven, so, when I occasionally meet a fellow typewriter owner of long and rich experience, I talk about the various machines I have hammered at. I had a grand talk of this kind with the general manager that morning, though of course he did most of the talking, out of a very long and rich experience. There is romance, the genuine glinting stuff in typewriters, and not merely in their development from clumsy giants to agile dwarfs, but in the history of their manufacture, which is filled with raids, battles, lonely pioneers, great gambles, hope, fear, despair, triumph. If some of our novels could be written by typewriters instead of on them, how much better they would be. What a ridiculous statement that is. A typewriter is a very difficult machine to manufacture because it has so many parts, from 1,500 to 2,000, mostly tiny, and it must be accurate. Imagine taking a typewriter to pieces, down to the very last screw, and then giving yourself the job of manufacturing all these parts and of assembling them accurately afterwards. I went first through the workshops where all the separate parts are made. It was rather frightening, like finding yourself inside a typewriter with some colossus hand working and writing on it. There seemed to be an awful lot of power for the space. There were dozens and dozens of small machines of the lathe kind, turning out springs and screws and nuts. These machines were so close together to one another, there seemed such enormous power harnessed between the narrow aisles that you felt that if one belt broke, you would be torn to pieces. But on the machine, each machine had a constant thick flow of lubricating oil. But on one machine the pouring liquid was crimson, and it looked for one startling second as if the moving metal had been drenched in blood. But that, I was told, is a new lubricant, strongly antiseptic. There are actually few accidents here, in spite of my fears, but I was glad to get out of that workshop, though I must say the mechanics themselves seemed cheerful enough. Across the way, the parts were assembled. I now know a great deal about typewriters that I never guessed before. I now know how they are made to look so black and shiny in front, for I saw the frame being sprayed with black lacquer and artificially dried. I now know how the pretty gold lettering is put on, for I saw them applying the transfers. I now know the type, and these people made all manner of type is manufactured, for I was shown how first a drawing is made 50 times the required size, then how from that a steel master is made 10 times the required size, and then how from that a die is made, and how this die stamps out the type in various busy little machines. I saw the typewriter being assembled, passing from hand to hand and becoming more like my familiar companion of the study at every fresh move. Every process seemed to me astonishingly ingenious and amusing. That is, amusing to plan and work out and first construct and then revisit occasionally, but not, of course, equally amusing to attend in a dumb, mechanical fashion for 8 hours a day. they had a clever management of moving coloured pegs in a board so that showed how everybody was getting on with everything. They must have had huge fun for the man who first worked it out, but not much fun for the people whose day-long activities are pegged there. In fact, what struck me here, as it did in most of these large-scale factories I saw, was the enthusiasm of the men responsible for all these ingenuinities. You know what I mean? For some reason, the brain's gone dead. Somebody post that up hyphenetically. Ingenuity. Oh, it's ingenious. I can't say the word. How extraordinary. And I've lost my place. Anyway, they it is who are the happy children of the mechanical age. They have never been allowed to play with gadgets to their hearts. They have been, I told you I'm reading this blind. They have been allowed to play with gadgets to their heart's content, and very well they have played too. Their cunning and resource are wonderful. What artful creatures the modern engineer is. Give him a wheel or two, a pulley and a moving arm, and he can make anything. He ought to be, and I think he is, the happiest of us all. We must not forget that though machinery has enslaved some people, it has liberated others, who have found themselves in a world they can enjoy. There is an ingenious, machine-minded man, not apt at expressing himself except in terms of mechanics, who comes to this perfect fulfilment in this age. When he is at work, he has machines to think about, and when he is at play, there is the motor cars and aeroplanes and wireless sets for him. You find men of this type, square pegs in square holes, in all the executive positions in these factories, and their happy enthusiasm is almost infectious. But there is a big drop from them to the mass employees, all caught up in the monotonous routine of work. Nor do bonus and welfare schemes, admirable though they may be, do anything to bridge the gulf between these two classes, the masters of the machine and the servants of the machine. It is not here a question of capitalism or capitalists and the proletariat, the bosses and the workers. The men I call the masters of the machine may not have a penny of capital, and they are the workers too, and workers who are ready to go on working long after the whistle has sounded. It's not a question of economic status at all. In the more old-fashioned enterprises in which machinery plays such a smaller part, you do not notice this sharp division between the employees, who can and must be interested, and those who cannot be expected to have any real personal concern for their work. But I suspect that the more we use machinery, the greater this gulf will be, and I do not see that any change in the economic system will do much to bridge it. If the state ran a factory, the division would still be there. It is, of course, rapidly becoming a division between the sexes, because the interested executives, masters of the machines, are men, and the routine workers, the servants of the machines, are recruited more and more from girls and young women. Not in the manufacture of typewriters, I have left that now behind. Some very big concerns engaged in highly organised production employ only a few men, because the men expect permanent jobs, but they can take on crowds of girls because it's assumed that most of them will leave to get married when they're in the middle of their 20s. But if this goes on, and it is going on, all of the prospective bridegrooms will be out of work. Here, in short, is a pretty little nest of problems. But for the moment, I must leave them. I have been all over the Imperial Typewriter Company's works and have duly admired the enterprise and I can't say it. Has anyone put it up there? Ingenuity. Ingenuity. Thank you. Ingenuity. Ingenuity. That's it. I've got it back. Ingenuity. Why couldn't I say that like a mental aberration? Ingenuity. Of course it is. Silly man that I am. I do apologise. Yes, he's been all over the Imperial Typewriter Works and duly admired the enterprise and ingenuity displayed there. And now it is time for lunch. Do you ever get that where you just suddenly start, I can't pronounce a word? Is that a thing, or is that just me? It is one of the directors of the above concern who entertained me for lunch. It was one of those. He has a house in what seemed to me very pleasant residential quarter of town, a quarter with wide streets and detached villas. This particular house was of excellent design, and when I was told that it had been built 40 years before, when houses were rarely designed or executed with any taste, I was curious to learn why my host should have been so fortunate. It seems that Leicester has had some time, more than 40 years, has had for some time, more than 40 years, a few citizens who have been first-class designers and craftsmen, and this house has been the creation of one of them. I remember then that I had heard of these Leicester craftsmen before, and indeed knew one or two good artists who had come from this place. During lunch, which was both substantial and good, a blue budgerigar flashed about the room like a handful of June sky. I then discovered that my host was a man with a hobby, the breeding of rare caged birds. After lunch I was taken into the garden, where I found the whole aviary, half a dozen wired enclosures sufficiently spacious, bright with velvety finches, parakeets and macaws, and yellow emerald and blue budgerigars that turned themselves, when they were disturbed, into sudden dazzle of colour. There were dozens and dozens of these brilliant little creatures, some of them amusingly tame, and all of them healthy and enjoying life. As he popped in and out of these enclosures, or offered some particular pet its favourite delicacy, my host was a happy man, gloriously riding his hobby horse, which must have been a fairly expensive steed. There was, in all this, something delightfully unexpected. You meet a middle-aged man of business in the prosaic provincial industrial town. You go with him to his house in a pleasant but tame suburb, and the next minute you see him among little tropical birds that flash like jewels. There are no more charming or droll adventures like this for a traveller. England will be England no longer. But this is still the country of gigantic hobby horses. My host himself seemed to think it wasn't. Men should have hobbies, he declared. But now, in this world of cheap, popular amusements, the hobby was not what it was. This I told him. Some of these old interests may have declined, though there was no great matter, as we could well spare them. But when one gets the facts, they always disprove these head-shaking statements about cheap, popular amusements driving this and that out of men's lives. You find on inquiry that men are still mounting hobby horses as gaily as ever. Many people forget that the patrons of cheap popular amusements, the cinema and the wireless and so on, have largely come from a class of persons that before did nothing in its leisure but gossip and yawn and kick the cat and twiddle its thumbs. Moreover, these people have far more leisure than they have ever had before. Very soon the hobby horse will be flourishing on a scale beyond the dreams of our fathers. So much I suggested to my host, who, when I asked him whether there was a dwindling interest in his hobby, was compelled to admit that so many of these coloured birds had been bred of late years and the prices had rapidly dropped. No, the hobby horse is with us, and I was delighted, on this occasion, to see it grow with such emerald wings. We'll pause there whilst I have a little sip. You see, sometimes when you read in advance, you can read and you could go, "What's that word? I wonder how that's pronounced," and you can look them up. And excuse my eye, it's got to twiddle my eye a bit. It's filling up with gunk this morning. Ingenuity, thank you. Yes, good morning, Richard. Nice to see you. Welsh wanderer Patrick, good morning to you. Stumbling over the words this morning. Richard Stronhold, RV, thank you for your readings of Priestley's book. Enjoying them. I'm sorry I'm bastardising the words. Morton Lewis, Turbo Stream. But where are you in Brummie? I'm a Brummie. So I core speak neither. Prosaic. Oh, is it Prozac? Like not like Prozac. Prozac, the drugs. Prosaic. Of course it is. My ignorance never ceases to astound me. As my father used to say, well, I used to visit my father when he was alive, and we would be talking about something, and bear in mind that he was a lot older than me and had been around a lot more than I. And I would say something, and then something would occur, and I would say something perhaps rather silly. And he would say, "Oh, Richard, you are showing your ignorance." And I would say, "But if I don't show my ignorance, how do I learn?" Because he would correct me. So, I don't know, say a magpie came across on the garden, and I would say, "Well, what is that bird, Dad?" And he would say, "Oh, Richard, you are showing your ignorance. It's a magpie. Don't you know that?" It's like, don't you know that? It's like, well, okay, I didn't, maybe I didn't know that. But it's very funny. I'm not going to lose these pages. Right, let's see how far I can get with this. 3. This is the next little... The chapters, I should say, are divided into sub-chapters. Or what would you call that? Because a chapter when it's divided into subsections, I suppose. Leicester has been a hosiery town in the last 300 years. Since the Industrial Revolution, it specialised in worsted hosiery, for which the Leicestershire long wools are very suitable. Recently, it's linked itself to other textile industries by its large manufacture of knitted goods. The biggest concern in the hosiery and knitted goods trade is the Woolsey Company, which has factories all over the town. I went over them that afternoon. Everywhere, except among the vats of dye, where men do the work, there were enormous rooms filled with women and girls, who worked with small machines at long tables. I saw no big machinery at any of the factories I visited. One has got into the habit of associating mass production with the mental pictures of vast machines. Into those oily maws go the raw material to be transformed into the finished product somewhere in the interior of the machinery. The reality is quite different. There is still far more hand labour than machine work. The machines that are used are nearly always quite small. In these factories at Leicester, you saw long rows of sewing machines worked by electric power but guided by hand. In some rooms, there were hardly a revolving wheel to be seen. I cannot describe the numerous processes I was shown. I was left with a dazed impression of miles and miles of stockings, underclothes, knitted dresses and the like, with bright acres of femininity at work on them. I remember a cutting machine that went through a thick, soft pile of material for men's pants, like a knife going through cheese. But that seemed the most dashing wholesale process on view, for after that immense amount of handiwork, merely eked out with electric power, appeared to be... Oh, I read that wrong. But that seemed the most dashing wholesale process on view, for after that an immense amount of handwork, merely eked out with electric power, appeared to be expended on the garments. They were energetic little machines that made buttonholes or sewed on buttons. But the most relentless of the machines had nothing to do with the textile side of the business. It made cardboard boxes and stuck labels on them. Here, the girls had to feed the machines at a very brisk pace, with pasted labels and the like, and this looked to me the worst set of jobs, for the horrible pace and monotony in all the rooms I visited. In another place I saw a girl printing, or rather transferring, the firm's name on pairs of socks. She had a pile of socks on one side, a pile of little transfer papers on the other, and a sort of iron in her hand, and with the speed with which she put the transfer on a sock and the ironed the name in, and then removed the used transfer, was enough, merely watching her, to make you dizzy. The manager and I stopped to look on. She was a pleasant-looking girl and quite bright. She explained that she was on piecework, had to do so many pairs of socks, hundreds and hundreds a day, and was generally able to make between £200 and £300 a week. The manager had been telling me that in his experience, girls preferred purely routine and monotonous jobs because they had learned the fairly simple and necessary movements. They could then work all that. Sorry. The manager had been telling me that in his experience, girls preferred purely routine and monotonous jobs because once they had learned the fairly simple and necessary movements, they could then work all day and think about something else while they were working. Their fingers could be busy with the sewing machines or irons, but their minds could be far away, wondering how Elsie was getting on with Joe, or brooding over the film stars, male and female, whose photographs we saw pinned up here and there. I said it seemed to me impossible that a girl who did the conjuring trick with the socks and the transfers could possibly be thinking of anything else. But she assured us that she could, and though it looked all wrong, she could be performing such a task at high speed all day. Truth compels me to add that she showed no signs of being anything but cheerful and healthy a young woman. Well, isn't that an insight to both the factories of the time and the male chauvinist statistic of Mr. Priestley? It's quite bizarre. In these factories, they are using some elaborate new system of organising and tabulating their production in its various units. I love this old language, the tabulating. Elaborate new system. I love this language. I wish people spoke in it more frequently today. It's just very beautifully and picturesque. It's very elegant in its onomatopoeic way of saying. It's very descriptive and yet at the same time very on the button. Digressing a bit there. So yes, in these factories, they're using an elaborate new system of organising and tabulating their production in its various units, with the result that these enormous rooms, some of them with hundreds of girls at work in them, almost look after themselves. You hardly see a sign of active supervision. The foreman class has nearly been eliminated. The embryo of a sock or pair of woolen pants finds its way into one room and then goes from floor to floor, perhaps from factory to factory, coming ever nearer to perfection in its kind, until at last it packs itself in a neat box with 11 others, and nobody responsible or authoritative has seen it on its way, and from the first to the last there have been no orders, no fuss. Only one or two men in an office know exactly what has happened from beginning to end. The plan is there, perhaps inside a desk, and the huge building with its crowded floors of busy work girls simply carries out the plan. You never seem to see anybody telling anybody else what to do. The places have a dumb secrecy and uncontrolled orderliness of a beehive or an ant-hill. It is queer, rather than frightening. Moreover, though the machine plays a big part, power being on tap everywhere, these are not places filled with machines, for the human element in labour appears still to be dominant. But the point is that this human element has been woven into a giant system of a miniature subdivision of labour until the whole place is really an enormous machine in which the workers are simply cogs and levers. We now see again, in a still more marked form, the great distinction between the fortunate few who are quite outside the machine and are capable of making changes in it, and the great mass of ordinary work people, mostly women, who are inside the machine, simply part of it. This distinction is so great that you feel that the two sets of people ought to belong to two different races. It is something too, I feel, that belongs to our own time. It is something too, I feel, that belongs to our own time, with its large-scale methods of production, its scientific systems, its experiments in the industrial psychology. 50 years ago, the industrial life, the difference between these classes outside the factory, was probably much greater than it is today, but it was not so great inside. At work, where you had all manner of people, sometimes supervising and sometimes lending a hand with a job, the work people in these new factories nearly always have a share in the profits, and of course they are much better paid and looked after than their grandfathers and grandmothers were in their young days. But for all that, I cannot help feeling that they really are much further from the controlling centre of things, the heart of the brain of the industry, than their grandparents were, for they cannot know what happened to the material they're working with half an hour before it reached them, or what will happen to it half an hour after they have let it go. Their outlook must necessarily be restricted to their one endless tiny task. They are not bullied or even nagged at. Their very weaknesses are elaborately taken into account. Their comfort is considered. But between the time they clock in and clock out, their central human dignity, which entitles them to our democratic system to vote as good as anyone else, has no real existence, except in that dream of life which occupies their mind as their fingers fly to do the mysterious one task. When I had seen as much as I wanted of this imposing industrial organisation, we lingered at the outer door, 3 or 4 of us, and began discussing the mechanical and monotonous work imposed on us by this mass production. There was no putting the clock back, they said, and I did not remind them that we would all be putting the clock back on the following Saturday at the end of summertime. There was a general agreement that we were committed to these industrial methods. The only thing to do now was to keep on cutting down the hours of this monotonous employment, which meant much more leisure, said one of them, and that meant that this leisure had to be organised. The whole point about leisure, another one objected, is that it should not be organised. A third said that most of the men working under his management didn't really want more leisure and didn't know what to do with themselves when some accident is thrust on them. The danger is, of course, that this robot employment will alternate with robot leisure, passive amusement as standardised and impersonal as the tasks as the machines. If within these next few years the hours are cut down in these highly organised factories, then the people who work their 5 or 6 hours a day in them should be encouraged to be as active and as individual and as freely creative as possible in their spare time, though I cannot help suspecting that if the encouragement is successful and these people are active and individual and freely creative in their leisure, they will soon want to make a full-time job out of being active and individual, and may take it into their heads to blow up the factories. The trouble is that a man does not want to work at something he despises in order to enjoy his ample periods of leisure. He would much rather work like the blazes at something that it expresses him and shows his skill and resource. And when I say man, I do not mean the race. I mean not the race, but the male. Women undoubtedly take more kindly to these monotonous tasks and grey depths of routine, chiefly, I suppose, because they expect less from work and have no great urge to individual enterprise. This is interesting commentary here that we wouldn't tolerate now. They have more patience and are passively with passivity and tedium, and know that they can live their real lives outside the factory or inside their heads. But 9 out of every 10 of those girls working in the long rows of machines only see their factory life as a busy but dreamy interlude between childhood and marriage. What would happen if you told them there were no marriages, there were no homes of their own waiting for them? Do they realise that the system that enables any number of them to obtain employment is quietly barring the door against the very young men towards whom they are already looking as the future and real wage earners? For one little piece of knowledge it offers me, this journey seems to uncover 6 great pits of ignorance. Already I stare into them in dismay and then leave them gaping behind me. That's a curious notion, that. How are we doing? The book is falling to smithereens. Gosh, how about that? I mean, social comment on the Times, as it was, in the southwest, not far away from Cadbury Factory. So Philip Hammond, good reading, Richard, and enjoy it very much, as does Mary. Thank you for the encouragement, by the way. Julia Hartley says, that's the nicest he's been about females. I know. Don't shoot the messenger, is all I can say. A recent convert to your channel, having lived 2 years in Wem. I've been to Wem. Enjoying your reading this evening from Melbourne in Australia. Wem's in Shropshire, isn't it? Morton Lewis, and thank you for enjoying it. When Priestley says £300, is that money? I think he's talking money in that instance. It would have been a fortune. My father, a skilled craftsman, only earned £25 a week in the 1960s. Yes, it is quite crazy, because I remember in the 70s, my first job, if I remember rightly, I earned £30 a week, which seemed a huge amount of money. Well, it was at the end of the 70s. It was right on the 79, 80 it was. I was earning £30 a week, and my mother took £10 of that for rent and lodgings. I think that's the figures that I had. I can't remember, but yeah. Ramibu says, Julia, yeah, they are too fat, skinny, mousy, or too boring and chatty. It was only before Richard. Yes. In the previous chapter, he was very derisory. Yes, of women. Welcome, everyone's saying welcome. The new viewers are so glad. All new viewers, we're glad to have you. We're definitely glad. Sorry, my eyes are a bit blurry this morning, having looked at close text and then to the text on the screen over there. Your book is falling apart. You've been beating the hell out of the COVIDs around your studio, says Barry. Yes, indeed. Let's see. I'll do a little bit more. Let's see how far it is to the next break. Oh, it's quite a journey. I don't want to split it up. There's quite a bit to the end of this chapter, but we'll go and we'll see how far we get. If I'm stumbling too much, I'll stop and we'll do a bit tomorrow. I have got some edits to get through. It's just ridiculous. Right, so this is section 4. I am enjoying this book, though, for all his attitudes and stuff. The insight is fascinating from a historical social point of view, if what he's saying is true, through the prism of a northerner looking at these factories. It's fantastic. The motor bus that took me from Leicester to Nottingham was not one of those superb coaches that I've already handsomely praised in this book. It was the most uncomfortable vehicle. It shook and rattled. When it reached its fair speed, it struck terror into my heart like a French express. At more than 40 miles an hour, we seemed to be swaying on the edge of catastrophe. Even then, it was going slowly. And even when it was going slowly, you could not read print inside it, your eyes being shaken like dice in a box. The back seat in the front, the back of the seat in front of mine danced a jig all the way. There were only 2 or 3 of us out of Leicester, but about halfway the bus suddenly filled up, chiefly with women and children who were probably on their way to the Goose Fair. The 2 small boys who sat behind me were only interested in filling stations. "Oh, there's a petrol shop," they cried every time. "Isn't it pretty?" They are lucky, those lads, for if their taste does not improve, they will be able to travel on all the main roads of England in an ecstasy of aesthetic appreciation. Perhaps many of their elders will think petrol stations pretty. Perhaps the confounded things are pretty, and we are all wrong about them. I tried to think this over, but the bus would not let me. The woman sitting next to me had a pale face, fine eyebrows, teeth much too large, and a gloomy little boy called Walter. And she and the woman across the aisle talked the whole time in tones of quite happy despair about some neighbour who was being compelled to sell a farm, and together they explored the mysteries of the situation, said the same thing to one another over and over again, and so passed a pleasant social half-hour. We rattled by a famous cricket ground, Trent Bridge, and finally arrived at the bus terminus in Huntingdon Street, which is well contrived for the manoeuvring of buses, but has claims to be considered one of the most dismal thoroughfares in Europe. Having seen Leicester at work, I had come to see Nottingham at play, with its Goose Fair. I know that Nottingham works too, though I imagine that it is not so prosperous as Leicester. It is not only foreign competition, but it's also certain recent developments in popular taste that have struck at Nottingham's chief trade, which is, or was, the manufacture of lace. The town was busy engaged in the lace, hosiery and silk trades, even when Arkwright, who had to leave Lancashire because of the weavers hated his machines, first settled there. It has been fortunate in not having to depend entirely upon the textile trades. Such big concerns as Players, the tobacco firm, Boots, the chemist, and Raleigh, the cycle company, have their headquarters in Nottingham. The town has some very rough quarters still, but it is developing itself sensibly both in the old parts and the new, the housing estates on the outskirts. I saw some photographs of council schools that have just been built on one of the housing estates, and they have obviously been most attractively planned and laid out, with gardens around them and a great playing field, thanks to the most progressive and energetic Director of Education. Whatever else is happening in Nottingham, the children, amply provided with open-air schools, are better off now than they have ever been before. But it was not the Nottingham of such excellent educational work any more than it was of the Nottingham of the lace and hosiery trade, or the Nottingham of history, the Civil War really being there, that I had gone to see. This was Goose Fair Week, the city's annual and ancient festival, and I proposed to see how Nottingham enjoyed itself, and also to explore one of the biggest present-day fairs. It was not just. Sorry, I might pause in a minute because I'm feeling my eyes dazzling in front of me, or the words jumbling. It was not unjust that I should single out this particular phase of life in Nottingham, for the city has always had a name for enjoying itself. among provincial towns, it is always passed as the most frivolous. I can remember hearing talk of it when I was a boy, when the annual football trips from the north frequently headed for Nottingham. It was supposed to be a paradise for commercial travellers of the livelier sort. Rumour had it that the place was rich with pretty girls who were anything but prudes. There were goings-on in Nottingham. So ran the legend, which turned the place into a sort of industrial Venusberg. The truth is, I suppose, that in the old days the enormous numbers of girls employed in the lace trade were more independent and fonder of pleasure than most provincial young women, and so the legend began. Certainly, in my tiny experience of it, Nottingham seemed gayer and in more robust Midland fashion than the other provincial towns, though its young women these days didn't appear any better looking than the young women elsewhere. They seemed to accompany their young men to all the pubs, but I'm not prepared to accept that as a mark of easy virtue. There are a great many pubs in the place, and now and then a rough house in one of the vaults down in the old-fashioned quarter, the Poultry, but that doesn't necessarily indicate an orgiastic life. Anybody know what that means? Orgiastic, orgiastic life. That it is even now less prim than most industrial towns is probably the result of tradition, for most industrial towns, certainly most of these in the north, grew up with an atmosphere of grim nonconformity, whereas Nottingham was a place of considerable importance long before the period of big profits and little Bethels. Not brothels, but Bethels. It's situated, of course, in the centre of England, and people who do not like it say that people lack both the solid virtues of the northern folk and the charm and kindliness of the south. The local accent is noticeable, having a harsh quality of the northern accent, without the levering and salt of rich dialect. In short, it's ugly speech. Goose Fair is not very complimentary about anything, really. Goose Fair, that ancient institution, does not mean as much as it did. To begin with, it has moved out of the market square to the forest on the edge of town, and then it is no longer regarded as an excuse for a general holiday. The children are given a half-day holiday for it, but the factories do not close. Still, it was impossible to be there 5 minutes without knowing that the fair was on, for almost every tram and bus announced "To and from Goose Fair." And everywhere there were small distinct signs of a holiday spirit in the town. I ate my first lunch in the popular cafe, which was well filled, chiefly with women, a fair proportion of whom appeared to have gone there to admire, quite openly, one member of the small orchestra. This conqueror, whether he was playing or going from table to table, distributed his favours with impartiality that I found much easier to admire than his musical powers. Indeed, I felt that he could have been an admirable musical genius in a silent film. Having looked my last upon this gentleman, I walked out into a fine afternoon and wandered round an open space that bears the astonishing name of Slab Square. A bus stopped close to me, so I climbed to the top of it, let it mount a hill and leave most of the town behind, and got off near a golf course. This golf course, on further acquaintance, suddenly turned into a deer park, where dozens of the fine velvety creatures were gleaming in the sun. And when I had crossed this deer park, I found myself near a great house, now a museum, and then in a garden sombrely shaded with old cedars. I smoked a pipe or two in the green gloom of one of these grand trees, feeling as remote from Nottingham and Goose Fair as a man in Damascus, for there was hardly a soul in the garden itself, and in the bright middle distance between the dark branches there seemed to be more deer than golfers. But this would not do, I soon began to tell myself. It was not getting on with the job, so I returned to the untidy, hooting streets, and in an upstairs room in one of them I ate two toasted scones and drank a pot of China tea that could hardly have been more thoroughly stewed than if you'd made it in China and sent it through the post. And after that, I walked round the centre of town again, foolishly entering the branch of a multiple tobacconist, and there bought 3 of the very worst cigars I've ever tried to smoke, and then went back to my hotel and stood for a long time at the door, watching the passing folk now coming out of their offices and warehouses. And when I was tired of this procession of faces, I tried a pub or two for a bit of riotous local colour, but I found none. Perhaps it was still too early, so I had some more food, and then, like everybody else, I went to the fair. And I shall leave it there. He's gone to the fair, and we've got more to read. Oh, that's so funny. Hopefully that has put my book back together again. Goodness. Oops. These poor old pages. Although this was published in 1933, this book actually was reprinted in 1979, so it's not done terribly well. Anyway, that was fun. I've enjoyed that. Let's just my eye. Just go through the comments before I go, and then I must get myself a nice cup of coffee and do some editing. I think the sun is shining outside in the UK. Here goes the ladies' man again, says Rami. Yes, Barry Stevens. Your book's falling apart, yes. That's right, okay. I'm enjoying it, though it makes me laugh all the while, getting the same history out of the Times. I know, it is very humorous. Lovely Julia says, I know I speak for many when I say thank you, Richard, for all the content you're putting out. You're absolutely helping me to cope with the situation. Oh, Julia, bless you. Philip Hammond says, many a true word, Julia. We miss you on screen. We do miss you. I've almost forgotten what you look like, Julia. She says, thanks, Mary. I really miss being there on Wednesdays and my regular walks, kindly facilitated by the lovely Richard. We get on so well, Julia and I have to say, you know. It is lovely, and it's such a damnable shame. So many people, you know, who want to go and just see their relatives and their friends and have a bit of time together. This is such a very mean and cruel virus and situation that we're all in. It is really appalling. Rami Boo says, I saw in the live last night someone suggested that we get a cardboard cutout of you. Oh no, that we need the real thing. We need the real thing. Lots of discussion between Julia and Rami Boo. Now, I'd like to see you read this book in the style of Farmer Piles, says Crail. I don't know how you pronounce your word, sir. Crail for Joel. Is it Crail? You want me to read it as Farmer Piles? Hang on then. Let me just try a little bit of that as Farmer Piles. Just to counter your curiosity. Or you will just do a little tiny section. In the section of English fairs and markets in my encyclopedia is the following statement. Nottingham has a fair for geese. I can only add that during my stay in Nottingham for the goose fair, I've never set eyes on a goose, and nor did I find one on the menu. The goose fair I saw was as usual you can't read that sodding word either. Agglomeration of roundabouts, shows and stalls, and no doubt some of these have been designed to attract the human geese. Any roots of this fair that add in the commerce has withered long ago. Anyway, it goes on like that. I could do it like that, but hello there, Farmer Piles here. I'm an action man, I am. Action man. If you haven't seen Farmer Piles, if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out on YouTube Richard Vobes Farmer Piles. Put that in the description, and you'll be well, either greatly amused or terribly put off. I have no idea. I'd like to see. Yes, Turbo Stream says I'm off to report a few veg seedlings for my repot rather. Good for you. Very true. Thank you for watching, everybody. Thank you for reading, Richard. That's very kind. Pronounced cry for joy. Ah, cry for joy. Thank you, cry for joy. Thank you for that. Does help. Graham Roffey says Farmer Piles real rules. Hello there. I'm a farmer, see. I like to do a bit of farming. There's my little dog. Little lovely little dog. Ain't you, little dog? Julia says, you are one of my best friends. I have a small circle of very close friends and confidants, and I am so grateful for it. Now more than ever. Puke, that was touch sickly. No, it wasn't sickly. I am very touched to be your friend. Cry for Joy says, you have made my day. I love Farmer Piles. Oh, you know, it's funny, isn't it? We're in this terrible situation and crisis with the virus. But this weird coming together, where we can't come together physically, but we can on this, we can laugh. And I know there are people who are suffering, and laughter is the farthest thing from their minds at this moment in their life. And many of them are in a very terrible, weak and pitiful situation. And we don't, of course, laugh at them. And the people who are working to save them, of course, are very serious-minded about what they do. But the rest of us who are in limbo at the moment, and of course treat these things deadly seriously, we also do need that mental release. And laughter is the best medicine, and somehow we are managing to do that, which is fantastic. You got Mary giggling, says Philip. Oh, fantastic. That's really good. S says, hello, I'm new to your show, but I'm enjoying it so much. I'm so thrilled. Thank you so much for coming along. I'm going to stop, unfortunately, now, but come back tonight at 8 o'clock British summertime, whatever that is, wherever you happen to be. But go to the Vobe show on YouTube at 8 o'clock, and we have a bit more fun in a different way. We have different fun. This is fun, reading the English, what's the name? There are so many other books that I would love to read to you as well, that we could have some fun with. But, you know, we'd probably be out of the lockdown by then, but you never know. I might just carry on doing this as a matter of course. Oh, excuse me. Sudden yawn. Yes, come. If you're new, come along at 8 o'clock to the Vobe show. Put the Vobe show into YouTube search engine, and I do a live at 8 o'clock for about an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, with lots of contribution, lots of chat, and we play in videos, and people get to ring in as well. So that's all good. Jay Blake, how about putting a laptop on your left facing the camera and Julia can Skype with you? We may well try that. We could try that tonight, actually. Put a laptop on. That's a very good idea. I could do that. Julia, as you're still watching, if you're still watching, I'll ring you later. I'm going to do my edits. I'll ring you this afternoon, and maybe we'll do a test and see whether the internet that I've got here will work, and we can get you to Skype on the show. That would be absolutely fantastic. What a good idea. Thank you, Jay Blake. The Vogue Show, 8 p.m. There we go. Put that in. Anyway, I must crack on because I want to get a video out for this afternoon for people, and then I want to have this video ready for tomorrow morning. So there's 2 edits to do, squeeze in today before I do the live show. Andy Stacey, see you tonight. Take care, one and all. Thanks so much for watching. Be safe, look after yourself, keep smiling through as much as you can, and love, hugs and kisses to you all from the Vobes. But it's been great. See you later on. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.